March 27, 1980. On the floor of the New York Commodities Exchange, silver is in free fall. It opened the morning near $21 an ounce. By the closing bell, it is worth barely half that. Traders call it Silver Thursday, and it is about to bankrupt one of the wealthiest families in the country. Two brothers, sons of a man once crowned the richest person on earth, are staring at a margin call for $100 million they cannot pay. 9 months earlier, they had a paper fortune worth billions built on a single, audacious bet: buy up so much of the world's silver that no one else could set its price. For a while, it worked. Then it didn't. But to understand how it all fell apart, you have to go back to the beginning. L.Hunt built one of the great fortunes of the 20th century out of East Texas oil fields. For decades, he was reckoned among the richest men alive, a wildcatter who turned leases and gambles into an empire of crude. He had many children, and among them, 2 sons, Nelson Bunker Hunt and William Herbert Hunt, inherited not just his money, but his instincts. They had grown up watching their father distrust institutions, distrust government promises, and above all, distrust paper money. By the early 1970s, that distrust had a target. Inflation was eating into the value of the dollar, the gold standard was gone, and the brothers wanted somewhere to park serious wealth that no government could simply print more of. Gold was the obvious answer, but new restrictions and taxes made it awkward. So the Hunts turned to silver. It was a precious metal. It was used in film, electronics, and silverware, and crucially, the total amount of it in the world was fixed. They began buying, quietly at first, then in enormous volume. They did not just buy futures contracts on paper. They took delivery of the physical metal, hundreds of tons of it, and shipped it to Switzerland under armed guard, storing it far from the reach of any single regulator. By the mid-1970s, the brothers, together with allies and family trusts, controlled tens of millions of ounces of silver. It was one of the largest private hoards of a precious metal in modern history. What made the plan so audacious was scale. Silver is mined and traded globally, but the amount immediately available on the market at any moment is limited. If you accumulate enough of it and refuse to sell, you don't just influence the price. You can effectively become the market. Sellers who wanted silver to borrow, lease, or deliver had fewer places to turn. Buyers looking for direction took their cue from a price that the Hunts, through sheer volume, were increasingly setting themselves. Through the second half of the 1970s, the price climbed steadily, but it was 1979 that turned steady into spectacular. Inflation fears were spiking across the American economy, and investors were hunting for a hard asset to hide in. Silver, sitting near $6 an ounce at the start of that year, began a climb that stunned even seasoned commodities traders. By December, it was near $35. Word spread on trading floors that the Hunts were behind it, that a Texas oil family was trying to squeeze the entire silver market. Middle Eastern investors, sensing the momentum, joined in alongside them. By January 1980, silver touched roughly $50 an ounce, an almost unimaginable 8-fold rise in a single year. On paper, the Hunt brothers were suddenly worth billions more than when the decade began. Financial journalists ran the numbers and arrived at a description almost nobody had used about a commodity trade before. The Hunts had cornered the market. They had taken one of history's boldest hard money bets and, for one winter, made it look like genius. A corner only works as long as everyone believes it will hold. And by early 1980, cracks were already spreading beneath the record price. The first problem was leverage. The Hunts had not paid for all their silver in cash. Much of the position was built on borrowed money and futures contracts, meaning their fortune was now tied to margin, to loans that assumed the price would keep rising or at least hold steady. A position built that large on that much debt was only ever a paper fortune until it was sold. And selling was exactly the one thing the Hunts could not do without crashing their own market. The second problem was attention. A price that rises eightfold in a year does not go unnoticed, not by regulators, and not by an exchange whose other members were increasingly furious. Jewelers, silverware manufacturers, and photographic film companies that relied on silver as a raw material were being squeezed by prices that had nothing to do with actual supply and demand. Smaller traders who had bet against silver, expecting gravity to eventually win, were being wiped out one margin call at a time. The exchange that hosted this trading, COMEX, was effectively watching a handful of players dictate a market that thousands of others depended on. On January 7, 1980, COMEX acted. It introduced new restrictions, informally known as Silver Rule 7, sharply raising the margin required to hold silver futures and limiting the ability to buy new contracts on credit. The rule was aimed squarely at large speculative positions like the hunts. It was, in effect, the exchange changing the terms of the game after watching one family come close to winning it outright. The message was blunt. The rules that had allowed this corner to form were being rewritten in real time, and not in the hunt's favor. Overnight, the cost of holding the position ballooned. The brothers had built an empire of silver on the assumption that the game's rules were fixed. They weren't. And the hunts, for all their wealth, had misjudged just how much political and institutional will existed to stop a private family from controlling a critical commodity market. Regulators in Washington were watching, foreign silver holders were watching, and the exchange itself now had every incentive to bring the price back to earth. Through January and February, the price began to slide from its January peak. It was volatile, jagged, but the direction had changed. Margin calls, the demands from brokers for more cash to cover a losing position, started arriving. The hunts met them for a while by borrowing more and pledging more silver as collateral. It was a solution that only worked as long as the price didn't fall too far, too fast. Nobody, including the brothers themselves, seemed to have a plan for what happened if it did. By mid-March 1980, the pressure that had been building for weeks reached a breaking point. Silver had already fallen substantially from its January high, and the hunt's position, still enormous, was bleeding value every single day. Brokers who had extended them credit were growing nervous. Some began quietly reducing their own exposure. The exchange, still operating under the new margin rules, gave the market no room to relax. Then came March 27th, Silver Thursday. In a single trading session, the price of silver fell by roughly half, from around $21 to around $11 an ounce. It was one of the most violent one-day moves any major commodity had ever experienced. For a family whose fortune was built on holding, not selling, this was catastrophic. The math was brutal and immediate. A position that had been showing paper profits in the billions was now showing losses on a similar scale. The hunts faced a margin call of about $100 million, due almost immediately, and they did not have that kind of cash sitting idle. Their wealth was in oil leases, land, cattle, and above all, in the silver itself, an asset that was now the very thing collapsing in value, and the hardest thing in the world to sell without pushing the price down further. They were, in the most literal sense, rich on paper and cash poor in reality. This was not just a Hunt family problem anymore. Wall Street had spent the past year extending credit against silver and against the Hunt's broader creditworthiness. If the family defaulted outright, the losses would ripple through the brokerage houses and banks that had financed the position, and from there into the wider financial system. A single family's failed commodity bet now threatened to become a systemic event, at a moment when memories of financial instability were still fresh. So a consortium of banks, led by Chase Manhattan, stepped in. They arranged a rescue loan of roughly $1.1 billion, secured against the Hunt's remaining silver holdings. It was not charity. It was firefighting, an attempt to stop a private family's collapse from becoming everyone else's problem. The loan kept the Hunts technically solvent and gave them time to unwind their position in an orderly fashion rather than in one more panicked crash. The rescue worked, in the narrowest sense. Wall Street did not follow the Hunts down, but the family's fortune had absorbed a wound it would never fully recover from. What had been, by some estimates, billions in paper gains just months earlier, had turned into a real, realized loss estimated around $1.7 billion. The corner was broken. The bet that was supposed to protect the Hunt fortune from an uncertain world had instead very nearly destroyed it in a single spring. The bailout stopped the bleeding on Wall Street, but for the Hunt brothers, the reckoning was only beginning. Regulators and rival firms had not forgotten how the price of silver had been pushed to $50 an ounce in the first place. Lawsuits followed for years, accusing Nelson Bunker Hunt and William Herbert Hunt of conspiring to corner the market and manipulate prices to the detriment of everyone else who traded silver. In 1988, a court agreed. The brothers were found liable and ordered to pay roughly $134 million to a mineral company that had suffered losses because of their actions. It was one judgment among several, but it landed on a fortune already hollowed out by the 1980 collapse and years of interest on the bailout debt. That same September in 1988, the Hunt brothers filed for bankruptcy. The sons of a man once considered the richest person on earth had run out of money. L.Hunt had spent a lifetime building a fortune on the belief that oil, land, and hard assets were safer than promises on paper. His sons inherited that instinct and pushed it to its logical extreme, trying to own not just a hedge against inflation, but a controlling share of an entire market. For one winter, it looked like the boldest, smartest trade in America. It ended as one of the most expensive lessons in financial history about the difference between being right about an asset and being able to survive the swings along the way. Silver itself recovered over the following decades, drifting through its own cycles of boom and bust, long after the Hunt name had faded from the commodities pages. COMEX kept the tighter margin rules it introduced in January 1980, a quiet, permanent reminder of the episode. Exchanges elsewhere took note too, wary ever since of any single player accumulating too much of a market. What the Hunt brothers proved, in the end, was not that hard assets are worthless as protection against inflation. It was that no fortune, however historic, is immune to leverage, to timing, and to the simple fact that markets, when pushed too far by too few hands, tend to find a way to correct themselves. They set out to become the exception to that rule. Silver Thursday was the market's answer.